Fancy. Hi, everyone. I'm Faisal, and welcome to migrating your app to Flutter. I'm actually going to move my slides to this screen so it's easier for me to talk and see you guys. So let me just make sure it's recording. No, it's not. One second. Stop share. Bring them here. Cool. Cool. All right. This should work. Great. All right. Awesome. Cool. So welcome to migrating your app to Flutter. In the past, I don't know, multiple Android summits and different conferences, I've been giving a very specific type of talk, which is like introducing Android development and like introducing Flutter development, learning what Flutter is all about. And so I did that a couple times, probably like 10 times in the past 3, 4 years. Then I started to go, okay, well, it feels like a lot of the community now understands Flutter. So what is the next talk I want to do, right? And what I try to avoid is advanced talks. And the reason why I avoid these advanced talks is that for something so advanced, it's really hard to capture the essence in 40 minutes, for example, right? But I think for beginner talks, it's very easy to kind of empower everyone and guide everyone to the right place in 40 minutes. And so I said, okay, what is a talk I can do that's not an introduction talk, but that is also a very useful talk for someone to be empowered and leave this talk with the knowledge and skill set that they need to go and discover this information and basically achieve what the talk is trying to do. And so about 7 months ago, I was reached out by a company. Unfortunately, I can't talk about the company's name, but it is a pretty big coffee company in America. It's not Starbucks. And they reached out to me and they said, can you port over our Android and iOS app to React Native? And I said, I can port it over, but I'll port it over to Flutter. And I convinced them on Flutter. I sold them why they should go Flutter. They were convinced. And so I said, all right. But they said, well, you only have 2 months to do it. And foolishly, I said, all right, sure. I charged them a lot of money for it, but I said, sure. And I started looking at the app and I'm like, man, this app is not going to be possible for me to port over in 2 months. The UI, absolutely. But the actual business logic and like the subtle, because this app's been in development for what? Like 5 years now, right? To port all that over in 2 months. And they had this weird 2-month deadline because they really wanted to get the app out for some sort of big sale that they're having in the coffee world. And so I said, all right, fine, right? Let's figure out what I can do. And so I said, okay, I started looking at strategies on how to port over an app properly, right? And once I did successfully, I got it in 2 months and like 2 weeks, I was able to get this app built, port it over to Flutter. I was pretty impressed. So I said, all right, let's make this a talk. A lot of people have Android iOS apps and they want to port it over, and what is the best way? So that's the genesis of this talk, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. And hopefully it's useful. So who am I? If you haven't seen me speak before or heard about me, I'm a Google developer expert, and I talk about Flutter, machine learning, whatever. I'm the co-founder of Irene. Irene is a cremation startup, so something very interesting that I'm doing. Actually, I was doing it like 2 minutes before this call. It's a very regulated industry, and we're trying to solve the problem of funerals in Canada and the complexity there, as well as the predatory practices. So working on that. As well, I do consulting for a company called Bitstrap, where I'm the CTO. And that's where I do a lot of machine learning and even Flutter projects. So I'm kind of like all over the place, trying lots of different things. So forget that, I'm going to talk about where Flutter came from. And I like telling the story. And if you've seen me speak before, you've probably heard the story before. But the idea is, I always like to go back to see where did Flutter come from and why should you use it, right? And maybe you're using it right now, but what's the problem that Flutter is solving? It's a cool technology. And so if you step back many, many years ago, inside of Google, there's like 3 different things happening, right? And this is all me that I've put up from bits of conversations that I've had with product managers, team leads at Google on Flutter. And, I've kind of crafted this story. I'm sure, this is like a true story in the movie sense where not everything accurately happened the way I'm saying it, but the general gist of it is true. Where at Google, they had Dart, which was doing fairly well inside of Google and had built this community outside of Google, right? Where that's how I kind of met Dart, where I said, wow, this is a great, fantastic language. The problem with Dart was it had a very bad PR, and the PR was JavaScript killer. And Hacker News was like just hating all over it. The Hacker News likes to get toxic about JavaScript. They're very defensive of JavaScript. And so Hacker News had all these negative things to say, and it kind of like was becoming an obscure language, right? While the numbers were still growing, but it wasn't like cool to be a Dart developer like it was to be a TypeScript developer, for example. And so internally, Google did some research, and Google said, well, who's using Dart a lot? And it turns out a very small team at Google called the Google AdWords team, very, very obscure. No one needs Google AdWords, right? It makes zero money for Google. They were using Dart. And they asked them why, and they said, well, it's a very easy language, and it's very easy for us to just write it in. It produces less bugs. But think about Google, right? They're tracking, all the developer productivity that they're doing, right? And they know when developers are producing bug, and how can we optimize this, and how can we make our developers' lives easy, right? And so they saw, wow, bugs are going down with Dart. This is fantastic. Parallel to this, there was another team, and this team had a different problem. The first team had a problem at Dart. How do we give life to Dart? The second team's problem was Google keeps asking us to build these mobile apps. And whenever we build it, we have to build it 2 times, right? The first time when we build it is for Android. The second time we build it is for iOS. So this is getting out of hand, right? And we have to compete at a global level. How can we possibly continuously build 2 versions of the same app and have these mismanaged timelines and stuff? Then on the horizon, you see something like React Native, you see Xamarin, and Google's like, well, why are we missing out on this? Can we do better? And so they had this team at Google, and they started investigating cross-platform apps, right? And they said, how do we build a better cross-platform framework? And the idea was, let's look at what React Native did, let's look at what Xamarin does, and let's look actually towards history, right? Flutter itself is not a new idea, a new concept. Yes, you can say React Native is there and stuff, but like even if you step back, it's not something revolutionary in the sense that if you grew up on the internet in the not 1900s and during 1990, 1997 plus, right? You probably used a tool called Flash Player, and if you look at it from a high level, that's really what Flutter is. It's Flash Player done correctly, right? In the modern context, it's Unity for apps, right? And what I mean by that is the rendering engine is controlled by Google. In the Adobe sense for Flash Player, it was closed source, so it had lots of security issues. With Google, Google said open source. Let's make sure it's open, it's very secure. Anyone can look at the source code and know we're not up to some shenanigans, and let's make it as compatible as possible. And so Flutter, the actual framework, the rendering engine is using, it's this concept of it will run absolutely everywhere, right? It'll run on mobile, any type of device that the Flutter team designs the rendering engine for, it will run. And so they said this concept is good, but where do we find a rendering engine that's like super, super portable without building one from the ground up? Because building rendering engines is very hard. And it turns out they had a rendering engine. The rendering engine was Google Chrome, right? If you look at Google Chrome, it's a browser, but what is a browser? It takes some HTML code, some JavaScript, whatever, and it draws stuff to the screen, right? And that drawing code runs on desktop, Mac, Windows, PC, Xbox, wherever Chrome exists, that drawing code runs there. So they already have a great library that actually draws pixels to the screen. So now all they needed was a language that can kind of write to that code because no one wants to write C++ or whatever that rendering engine's written in, right? It's not a user-friendly language to write complicated mobile apps. And so they said, all right, let's find a language. And so what I assume they did is they had a big Google spreadsheet, right? And in this Google spreadsheet, they said, all right, let's make up a matrix and let's go and find the right language for this. In this Google spreadsheet, you had Python, Dart, Python, Google Go, Java, whatever, Dart, Kotlin, all that stuff. And so they went line by line. They had a bunch of use cases. And it turned out, after doing all this research, it was close, but it turns out that Dart kind of won this, right? And they looked at all these different cross-functional teams that were using Dart. They looked at for developer productivity, the syntax of the language, future-proof the language. And they said, wow, you know what? Dart is the language. So they kind of had this marriage where they said, team one that was trying to find what's next for Dart, and team two that was trying to find a language for the future of mobile development found themselves, right? And that's where Sky was born, which is what the code name was for Flutter. And so with this gave rise to, over the years, Flutter has grown dramatically. And if you look back, the use case that they really solved was, we don't want to continuously build two apps at the same time, and we want the apps to have pixel perfection on both platforms. We don't want the platform dealing with rendering. We want our own rendering engine so that if I build an app, it will run the same on Android and it will run the same on iOS. It doesn't matter which iOS or which Android it's running on, right? And so, at a high level, this is how Flutter works, right? There's material widgets or Cupertino for iOS, or even your own custom widget set, right? And then there's this rendering that kind of tells, which colors to show, all that stuff. You have animation, painting, gestures. Then you have services, and we're going to be talking about services a lot. Services are a way to talk to the native world, right? And it's for a way for Dart, the rendering engine, the Flutter rendering engine, to tell the device, hey, device, give me access to your GPS. Give me access to your phone vibrator, right? Give me access to this stuff, because the rendering engine when you write Dart code and Flutter code, it's actually drawing pixels on the rendering engine and doing business logic at that level. But what if you need access to other stuff? So that's where you hook into a service and it will go and fetch that data. And then below, you have all this like hardcore computer science stuff. If you're interested, you can go on Flutter, where it's like the virtual machine, the engine, the Skia rendering engine, Mojo, which is like this abstract concept that all these widgets are built on. And so that's how Flutter is. And so to recap, Flutter's entire ethos is all around 60 frames per second, native on Android and iOS. Web is coming soon, desktop is coming soon. And so whatever code you write is going to run at 60 frames per second on all these platforms. It's fast, beautiful, and natural. I'm going over this quickly because I've given this portion of the talk before, but this is, very high level beginner stuff, where fast just means, 60 frames per second. If you write crappy code, your code's going to run crappy, right? I mean, it's not a problem with the virtual machine. But so if you write good code, it's going to run fast. Beautiful, while subjective. Google has made sure that material design works perfectly on Flutter. In fact, for the longest time, the material design team and the Flutter team sat close to each other, beside each other, right? And so, I can imagine how annoying it might be to have designers sitting beside you to be like, hey, move that pixel up. But that's essentially what happened, right? The material design team had all these amazing designers, and they made sure that Flutter's implementation of material design is actually better than Android's implementation of material design. And in fact, the material design team uses Flutter to prototype future material design concepts. So that's how advanced Flutter is, especially when it comes to design. And all natural means is, if I build a Flutter app and it runs on Android, it's going to behave like an Android app. It's going to have the same physics, same animations, And if I run it on iOS, it's going to have the same physics and same animations. So with that, this is basically the pitch I told this coffee company. And I said, blah, 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 blah. And they were like, okay, fine, let's go with this. So with that, I said, all right, we have one code base. I'm going to write one code base, and I need access to multiple platforms, right? Android, iOS, and they also want some web stuff in the future. And so I said, okay, how do I do all this in 2 months? If I were to look at this Android app and iOS, which are two separate repos right now, when they handed over me the project, how do I actually convert all this code into Dart code, and how do I get this running very quickly in 2 months and build out, all this UI stuff? The short answer is I can't, right? Impossible. And I even went, did a Google search, I admit, saying Java to Dart converter, right? And I said, does such a thing exist? Does something like Objective-C to Dart exist, right? Nothing like that exists. And maybe someone tried something, but it's not for production code, especially when a client's paying you all this money. So I said, all right, what's the first thing I can do? And so I had this idea, and all my ideas come in showers. So I was taking a shower one day, probably stressed out, like, how am I going to do this in 2 months? And I had this idea, and the idea was, well, why don't we take all the business logic that exists on Android, on the Android app, and all the business logic that exists on the iOS app, and make it into a plugin, right? That way, I don't have to worry about rewriting business logic, rewriting those unit tests, making sure it's working, all sorts of legacy hacks that they have in this app. And I just encapsulate all that into a black box. And I expose all those functions, all that logic via a function or multiple functions that my Flutter app can talk to. And so what I did was, So what I did was, I don't know why my slides are out of order. What I did was I said, okay, let's create a plugin, right? And what a plugin is a way for you to expose the native world, right? In my case, the native world was Kotlin code as well as Objective-C code. So I wrote this wrapper, and this wrapper was a lifesaver because all I really did was I copied over all the code that was non-UI. I said Flutter new plugin, new wrapper, and I created like one file that had like essentially what boils down to a massive switch statement, which is like if get products, if Flutter wants get products, then go call get products from this native library, right, that I wrote. That has already been written. And so I did that over and over again. And, I was able to quickly implement that services layer. So before that, let's jump to, I don't know why my slides are out of order, but let's go to the 5 things I did and 5 things I learned, right? First, I audited my code base, which I talked about right now. And then I also created plugins. Now, auditing your code base is a lot more nuanced than just like saying, well, can I just create a bunch of plugins, right? The first thing I checked was, are there any specific database requirements? This luckily was not an issue with this coffee app, but I know a friend of mine who was porting an app ran into this, where this company used a very esoteric database, not SQLite, but something very specific to Android and iOS, that a library doesn't exist for Flutter, right? And it's not that the library doesn't exist, it's that it's hard to bring that library over, but you don't have time. You're not getting paid to rewrite a database library. You're getting paid to port over an app. And just the mere fact that you could rewrite this entire database library in Flutter was a big daunting task. So he unfortunately had to, come up with very different ways to migrate data. The other thing was specific OS requirements. Again, wasn't a big issue for me. This coffee company didn't care which OS it ran on. They just wanted everything to run on, recent stuff. And then the other thing was, I spoke to stakeholders and I made sure that, hey, are you, in 2 months, are you suddenly going to rewrite the whole app? That all this is a waste, right? This happened to a friend of mine where he built an app And like 3 months later, they came out with a whole new UI. They said, well, and if 3 months ago they were just told him, then the act of porting would have been a lot easier because you could have started fresh anyways. And so talk to stakeholders, get an idea of what the future roadmap is. But definitely when you first think about porting a project, figure out if you do you have specific database requirements and do you have specific operating system requirements. Flutter sometimes won't work on, if their client wants to run on Android, I don't know, 4.0, for example, right? I think Flutter has a minimum of 4.1. So make sure, or even Android 2.0 in some developing part of the world. The second thing is what I said was create plugins, right? And we just went over the slide where look at your core business logic. Can you rewrite it in Dart? I know for this coffee company, I couldn't just rewrite the whole thing. So what I did was I created a plugin. And what was great about going back to the plugin development was it's not only does it save time, but it also gives confidence in the client that, hey, Flutter is pretty cool, right? Like there's not a lot of bugs happening. But the client doesn't know that you're rewriting, you're porting over the same business logic and stuff. And the client's excited that, hey, I told the client that this is what I'm going to do. And the client was very excited actually. And the client said, wow, we could just reuse all this code. That's awesome. That means you just take the old code base and suddenly the entire UI is in Flutter now that you're rewriting it. And it was pretty cool. And so create plugins. The third thing was very complicated, and it's user migration, right? On Android and iOS, you could use core data or SQLite to store your user data. And so how will you migrate those users to your Flutter app when they update? This is something that a lot of people kind of run into because sometimes you're using a library like Room or a bunch of ORM for iOS or Android, that the act of porting all that over, you might cause data inconsistencies. So what I recommend, one of the first things you do is deal with that, right? I unfortunately left that till the very end, and that became an issue because the way I started thinking about, and I don't know why I left it to the very end, it's a mistake I made, where I started to think about, I built out the UI, all the models and all that stuff. And then I'm like, well, whoops, I totally forgot about what happens when the user's already logged in and upgrading their app, right? From a native Android or iOS app to my app. And how do I deal with that? And so that, was the extra 2 weeks that unfortunately happened of me like rewriting and thinking core parts of the code just to handle this migration properly. So after that, this took me a long time. And so this is something that I want everyone to think about. Analytics migration. When you're migrating a small app, it's okay, right? You might have 100 users, 200 users, but when you're migrating an app like this coffee app that has, I think cumulatively probably, I think around like 600,000 users or even 1 million installs. Analytics for a company this size is very key, right? And they have all these dashboards that are built that are hooked into Google Analytics and all this stuff. But when you're building your Flutter app, it's very hard to match that analytics one by one. And I don't mean event tracking. Event tracking is easy. What I mean is screen tracking and screen flows. Because to give you an example, if you're an Android developer, you might have 3 screens that trigger a wizard, right? For example, or not a wizard, but you have some flow. And on Android, you have 4 activities that are firing in this flow. So you click A and it creates a new intent, fires a new activity, on and on and on, right? Or maybe you have like a page view spinner. On Flutter, you would do it as conceptually a very different way, right? You would handle this in a very different way. And so if you were to just rely on Firebase Analytics default tracking, the analytics will all be messed up. And this happened post-launch where they got very agitated and they said, well, it looks like no one's going through our checkout funnel anymore, but sales are happening. So how is this happening? I thought you put in the right analytics. And it's because their checkout flow on the Android app was actually 3 or 2 activities. On Flutter, it was just one screen that rotated the view. And so just by having that, that broke parts of the app. And so, you have to go back in and add the right events and it fixes it. So keep that in mind. It will just make you look more professional. And the other thing, this was a very specific thing, is if you're porting over an e-commerce application, one of the issues with e-commerce is on web and older SDKs of Google Analytics, they support, this is very specific to e-commerce, but they support something called enhanced e-commerce analytics. Enhanced e-commerce analytics does not exist in the same view nor in the same table, I guess, on Google's infrastructure for Firebase. Even though I use enhanced e-commerce for Firebase, the events did not go to the same place. Even though the exact interface to call those SDKs and everything is exactly the same, they don't go to the same dashboards. And so again, this threw them off where they saw sales dropping, right? Because as people were moving over, sales started to drop, and it was like, I got freaked out because I was like, well, this makes no sense. I'm seeing revenue come in. So why are sales dropping? Why are you saying sales are dropping? And we had this discussion, I remember, where I'm like, I see you just made like $300,000 yesterday. What do you see? And he's like, well, on our dashboard, it shows you we only made $30. And I said, how does that even make sense? We're seeing the same Google Analytics dashboard. And it turns out that when you have an older version of Google Analytics and you start using Firebase Analytics, which is a default for Flutter, they create the same analytics project, but it creates 2 separate views. And so they were looking at an older view. And I told them, okay, well, can you look at Firebase now? They said, absolutely not, because all our tools, all our BI tools are hooked up to Google Analytics, not Firebase Analytics. And so I did what I had learned in this project, build a plugin, right? I went and I grabbed an older SDK of Google Analytics, and I wrote a plugin that sends this specific stupid event back up, and it was all working again, right? So think about analytics. If your company is modern already and using Segment, all the best. But if you're migrating an older legacy app, which this app was, that was being built for like 5 years, you're gonna have older SDKs. You're gonna have lots of just like stuff that hasn't been updated. Like this SDK that they were using hasn't been updated in like 3 years because Google has moved on to Firebase Analytics. But there's no clear migration path from Google, right? So you'll run into issues like this. Lastly, Flutter is awesome for UI. I mean, it's awesome for everything, but it's awesome for UI. So do not start working on the UI right away, right? I told the client for the first 3 weeks, you're not going to get any UI updates. You have to trust me that I'm working on it. 3 weeks later, you're going to start seeing UI updates like every day. And I spent these 3 weeks writing those plugins, porting stuff up, right? Because UI, you can make UI really easily in Flutter, and you can use this 3 weeks to kind of tell the designer, hey, designer, remember all those things that you couldn't do on Android and iOS? Well, guess what? You can now do this on Flutter. So start thinking about, you have 3 weeks or X weeks, whatever your timeline is, start thinking about these nice animations. Look at these material animations package set. Look at these hero animations, right? We can build this now. And so do the UI last. I know it's very tempting to do UI first, start thinking about all sorts of patterns and all that stuff, but leave all that to the end. Worry about getting your business logic in place, worry about getting users migrated, and the analytics story. I mean, obviously you need UI for analytics, but actually get figure out which analytics you're using, the database, all that stuff. So do the UI last. Lastly, this is what I did. Deploy your new Flutter app. I would say roll it out slowly, right? As tempting as it is to go on Android and iOS and go full 100% rollout, roll it out super slowly, and only roll it out on Android. iOS is so annoying to constantly push out updates. So forget iOS for now, right? Roughly your app will run fine on iOS. most likely your client's entire team is iOS. Just always happens to me. I'm the only Android guy with the Android phone, but push it push it out on Android first. This way you catch bugs that are UI specific and even Android specific. Because you've written a plugin, you're not going to catch errors in business logic on iOS, unfortunately, but that's okay because at least once you have this Android rolled out and you kind of hardened it and made sure it's working, you kind of know which areas that you might run into issues with. And that's what happened where, you know, I rolled out Android for 5% or 10%, and I saw an issue with discount codes. And I said, this is interesting, discount codes are crashing. And it turned out this was the same type of crash on iOS too, just because the way I was passing in data from Flutter to these plugins. So it wasn't the plugin that was the issue, it was just me passing in the data. And so pay close attention to Crashlytics. I would recommend adding like a real-time logger to it so you can start seeing data coming in full real time. But yeah, so, to push it out slowly, then get to iOS. In the meantime, you probably should have had like a big test flight testing going on. So you're kind of confident that it's going to work pretty well on iOS as well. Lastly, yeah. So if you're an Android developer, all this sounds good. You're excited. You want to move to Android. This is what you should do. Look at Flutter for Android developers. It is I think this URL is actually old, but this URL will still work. Search up Flutter for Android developers. It will take your knowledge as an Android developer and you can find the exact one-to-one match on Flutter, right? A really smart guy wrote this, me. No, I'm joking. I did write this. But, I wrote this like 2 years ago and, we've kind of updated it. So it's a good guide. You'll enjoy it. Flutter for iOS, this time an actual really smart person wrote this. It's an amazing guide. This actually helped me a lot when I was writing plugins because I wanted to kind of understand. I didn't know iOS at all. I went actually reverse. I said, well, how does it even work in iOS, right? And so this was very useful. Web developers, unfortunately, it's not the best of guides because it's not a one-to-one analogy from Flutter to web development, but do check this guide out. It talks about styling and just kind of thinking about how navigation works on Flutter versus the web. And so with that, it was a lot of information. The slides are going to be available. I'll paste the link in the chat. And feel free to email me if you're starting a big project and you want to figure out how you can do get some advice on some strategies that I used. And thank you. I'm open to any questions. I guess they'll happen in the Zoom Zoom chat. So, please ask questions. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you, Faisal. That was a great talk. Folks, if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat here, or you can always reach out to Faisal in the Slack channel.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelvin.
We will wait a couple more minutes, see if people type in some questions in this line. So you can see the chat, right?
Yep, I can see it. Thanks, Michael. I miss being in person. It's really hard to see if my jokes are actually working. Kelvin, Xamarin to Flutter, I haven't looked at it. However, I think that would be a much bigger shift because if you're writing a lot of C# code, you don't have an easy way to go to interface Flutter code to C#, right? So it's going to be hard. But I haven't used Xamarin, so I can't speak to that. Yeah, I agree with what Juan said there. Dart, while it seems like going back to Java, Dart is actually, I would say, a very boring language in the sense that it's very easy to learn. Dart, sometimes languages kind of impair you to making creative decisions, right? Where like Rust, I would say, is a great example where I have an idea And Rust is a fantastic language, but I have an idea and I know how to implement it conceptually, but I have to spend like an hour figuring out the rules of Rust and how to implement it, right? Whereas Dart, if you have an idea, you can translate that to code very quickly, right? And Dart kind of helps you along in that process. So, you know, that's why Dart is the boring language, because it's almost like you already know it, right? You're just kind of, you know, looking at better ways to do it. Whereas in Rust, you have to really take your time and like understand the deep intricacies of the language. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. Feel free to email me, add me on Twitter. Would you? Yeah, I would. Actually, I'm doing that right now, where we're building out a Flutter UI and we're using the Bluetooth library for Flutter to interact with physical devices. So like smartwatches and what was the other thing? Like a smart weight scale, but we're using Flutter for that. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Faisal, again.
Take care.